In the pre-dawn hours of October 30th, 1992, a 23-year-old man was out having fun, drinking with a female companion. Now this would take place in Issaquah, Washington in a tavern. It's not known what the relationship between them was, but they seemed like friends, because the man's hometown was about 30 miles away from this tavern, so I highly doubt he drove 30 miles from his hometown to a bar alone. But either way, the two were having fun drinking. Then they decided to leave. My guess is because at this time it would have been very late, like 2 a.m. And Washington state law mandates that bars stop serving alcohol by 2 a.m. So they would have had to leave. So after they left, mind you they were still both drunk, they drove from the tavern to a house in the Pine Lake residential area. Once they got out of the car, they continued to drink. I'm guessing this was the woman's house since there was no one else in it other than those two. The house was a standard house of the time, but it also had a hot tub, which they decided to drink in. After some time, the man asked the woman if she wanted to go swim, but the woman was confused because she didn't have a swimming pool, but he meant to swim in the Pine Lake Park. See, the Pine Lake Park region had a residential area and an actual lake area, which was in walking distance of the house. So the man decided he was going to go for a swim in the lake, but the woman initially refused, but then warmed up to the idea, so they began walking to this lake. Now, the lake was where families could go and have a great time swimming in, but this was only allowed in the day and not at night, since at night, well, there's obviously no lifeguard on duty, so this would create a safety hazard, so the lake was closed at night. But there was no security guard to really enforce this, so the man and woman just jumped the fence. They basically entered the lake illegally. But when they entered, the man went straight for the lifeguard tower. As I said, this was a public lake where people would swim at, so this explains the lifeguard tower. And with like most towers, they had a chair, and this chair would be elevated, designed for use by trained staff during the day. The man decided he was going to use it as a diving board because I guess the alcohol in him clouded his judgment, or he really wanted to impress the woman. So he climbed the tower/chair intending to dive into the water, even though the woman was protesting it. But once he got to the top, he dived headfirst into the water. See, this wouldn't really be too bad if the lifeguard tower wasn't positioned to be so close to the shallow water and not deep water. So the water that he dived into was very shallow, likely to be only 4 to 5 feet deep, and when he headfirst dived into the water, the man would headfirst slam right into the lake bed, which could have been covered in rocks or who knows what. This would cause the man to suffer severe neck trauma, like a spinal cord injury, immediate paralysis, and the inability to swim or even move, and this would cause him not to surface. Remember, the woman was just standing close to the lifeguard tower, just watching, but when she realized that he wasn't resurfacing, she panicked and started to scream for help. This scream would actually catch the attention of a nearby resident, a man, Dr. Whitten. He climbed over the fence to go see why the woman was screaming. But this would also catch the attention of another neighbor. This neighbor thought that Dr. Whitten was a prowler, or he was trying to rob the woman. So this neighbor grabs a gun and shoots it in the air, trying to scare him off. Fortunately, no one was hit, but this would startle Dr. Whitten, but he kept running to the woman screaming, "What?" The woman would tell the man about the situation, and Whitten would go in the water, pull the man out, and start CPR. Remember, this is in the 90s, and there was no cell phones yet, so no one had called 911. Only until one of the other neighbors heard a gunshot, and that's when they called the police. So the police came to the scene thinking there was an armed man, but instead they found a woman and a man trying to save another man. The drowning would only become clear once emergency services arrived on scene and assessed the situation. But by the time they finally realized what had happened, the man had already died. Still, the paramedics took over CPR, administered oxygen, possibly used a defibrillator, and prepared the man for transport. The ambulance would transport him to the Overlake Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. The police did an investigation and found out the neighbor had shot in the air and his reasons for doing that, and then they questioned the woman. The police's final report would say they found no foul play, and no arrests were made in the end. Jamie Lee Horton had just gotten a new snowmobile and was super excited to start riding it. Since he lived in Minnesota, there was an abundance of snow, which made it great for riding snowmobiles. This wouldn't be his first time riding snowmobiles. On the contrary, he grew up riding them and absolutely loved them. Jamie lived with his parents. Even though he was 32 years old, his parents didn't mind. He never got into trouble and he wasn't a pest. So on February 2nd, 2002, Jamie would decide to take his new snowmobile out for a spin. He intended to visit a friend who lived about 15 miles away. But to get to his friend, at least the way he wanted to get to him, was riding through the rural fields of Haverville Township. And through these fields were trees, rocks, and barbed wire fences for private property. But this was the way he wanted to get to his friend's house, so he left on his snowmobile. Now the day that he went was a Saturday, and this Saturday brought poor weather conditions to southeastern Minnesota. The sky was hazy and misty, with wind and blowing snow. This would create dangerous visibility issues, but he thought he could handle it, which he was. But as I said, the conditions weren't ideal for snowmobiling, so not surprisingly, when Jamie was traveling northbound on the east side of 70th Avenue Northeast in the 2900 block, at some point during the ride, likely while cutting across a private farm field, he collided head-on with a barbed wire fence. The wire strung between wooden posts and used to contain livestock was not highly visible in the blowing snow. The thin strands of sharp wire suspended between wooden posts would have blended in with the snowy backdrop, especially with no bright markers or warning signs visible in the mist. And I guess Jamie didn't see it, at least in time, and the impact was quite violent. Traveling forward with no warning, his snowmobile struck the barbed wire, possibly at head or neck height, depending on the terrain and its position on the vehicle. The wire didn't give away, it caught him. The collision caused catastrophic injuries. The barbed wire tore into Jamie's neck and head, inflicting wounds consistent with severe cervical trauma. It may have nearly decapitated him or caused fatal damage to his airway, blood vessels, or spine. The force of the impact likely threw him from the snowmobile, his body possibly rolling or collapsing into the snow within seconds. There was no helmet or jacket strong enough to stop the wire from cutting through him at that speed and angle. He died there alone in the snow, with no one around to witness or intervene. He was only found later that morning. Emergency responders were called, but there was nothing they could do. Jamie had died at the scene. Now, the authorities did not find evidence of excessive speed, alcohol, or erratic behavior. He was simply riding alone through conditions that made even a familiar environment treacherous. His mother, Pam Horton, later told reporters that her son had left to visit a friend, and he was on his way there when the accident happened. She believed the fence had been obscured by snow and was difficult to see. The county coroner arrived on the scene and noted that although the wind was blowing at that time, visibility appeared acceptable. That detail would later become part of the legal controversy that would follow. And the days after his death, the Horton family filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Jerome Lawler, the landowner whose fence Jamie had struck. The family's claim centered on the argument that the barbed wire fence had not been adequately marked for winter visibility, especially given that snowmobilers commonly pass through that area. The defense responded by stating that Jamie had been trespassing on private property and that the fence was part of a normal, legal maintained farm operation. The trial presented a difficult and emotionally charged case. Was the landowner responsible for not making a wire fence more visible in the snow, or was Jamie, even as an experienced rider, responsible for entering private property and not recognizing the hazard? Ultimately, the case moved forward, with the jury tasked with determining liability. No criminal charges were ever filed, and the death was ruled an accident. On the morning of April 10th, 2025, a rural property outside Tulane, Victoria, began its day like many others across Central Australia's farming belt. The early hours were cool and quiet. Morning fog lingered slightly over low pastures. By mid-morning, the air had warmed, and the property was active. A flatbed truck had arrived with a delivery of rectangular hay bales, and preparations were being made to begin unloading. The delivery was typical for the area. Farms across Tulane and surrounding districts rely heavily on transported feed during dry months. The bales were arranged in 3 tiers, stacked in a pyramid formation with 2 full rows and a third centered on top. Each bale measured about 2.4 meters long and 0.9 meters high, and varied between 350 and 500 kilograms depending on compaction and moisture content. The truck driver was a 48-year-old man, believed to be well acquainted with regional transport, was on foot beside the trailer. His role was likely to assist with positioning or documentation, while a tractor operator prepared to lift the bales using hydraulic forks. The unloading process began. The truck moved slowly toward the trailer. No cones or exclusion zones had been marked. The ground was dry and level, though no buffers were in place to separate on-foot personnel from the lifting area. What occurred next was not anticipated. One of the top-tier bales had shifted. There was no external trigger, no visible warning. A slight lean, a vibration, or even tension in the twine could have been enough. The bale came free from its centered stack and rolled from the trailer's edge. In less than a second, it fell, and it landed on the man standing below. The impact was severe. The bale, now moving under gravity, struck the man's head, shoulders, and chest. The full weight drove him into the compacted earth below. The force caused catastrophic trauma. His ribs collapsed, internal organs were damaged by the pressure, his spine and skull may have fractured on contact. A nearby worker witnessed the incident and immediately called 000. Emergency responders from Health Codes or Bendigo were dispatched without delay. Now, given Tuline's rural isolation, response time ranged from 15 to 30 minutes, depending on road conditions and team availability. When paramedics did arrive, they found the man unresponsive and pinned beneath the bale, and there was no sign of life. The bale was moved using the tractor under medical direction so that his body could be respectfully recovered. Police were informed, the site was sealed, and WorkSafe Victoria was contacted shortly thereafter and initiated a full investigation. The process began with photographic documentation of the site, equipment, and layouts. They reviewed the positioning of the bales, the tractor's location, and spoke to any witness present. They noted that the trailer lacked any lateral to secure the top-tier bales. Investigators also noted that no visible safety barriers had been in place. There was no cones, tapes, or personal exclusion zones around the trailer or lifting path. The tractor operator's visibility had been limited by the height of the bales and was unaware that the man was positioned within what safety manuals refer to as the fall radius, also known as the insecure zone. It was further noted that no spotter had been assigned to the operation. In many large agricultural or industrial settings, a secondary person oversees blind zones during mechanical movement, but in this case the task had been performed informally. Not uncommon in smaller or independently operated properties. Although the trailer used was not equipped with bale guards, upright steel supports along the sides designated to prevent lateral slippage. Though not legally mandated on every farm vehicle, their absence during high-tier loading increases fall risk. WorkSafe process would continue in the weeks that followed, including a full analysis of medical condition, load documentation, site safety history, and a final report summarizing all contributing factors. Tuline itself is a quiet farming town northwest of Bendigo. The land is flat and open, making it suitable for broad acre operations and hay production. With a population of just over 200, it's a tight-knit community, and it's familiar with hard work, shared responsibility, and practical labor. But incidents like these are rare, but when they occur, they affect everyone involved. Now, the victim's name was not released to the public, but he was remembered informally by peers in the freight and farming community. And as of now, the company has not been sued or fined. On a bitterly cold day in December 1989, the Ramford Brewery in Essex, England was wrapping up the holiday season. The air inside the sprawling industrial building was thick with the scent of fermenting hops and yeast. Metal pipes hissed, valves dripped, and towering fermentation vats, each capable of holding thousands of gallons, lined the interior like monuments to Britain's beer-making legacy. For Ronald Henry Fincham, a 60-year-old brewery worker, that day marked 25 years of service. He had been a steady fixture at the brewery, quiet, consistent, and experienced. After a workplace gathering to mark his 25th anniversary, he disappeared from the social area without explanation. Hours passed, he never returned home, and his co-workers began searching the premises. They eventually found a troubling clue: his clothing, neatly folded on the floor near one of the towering vats. This industrial tank was filled with over 35,000 pints of beer, or roughly 20,000 liters of liquid. Still uncertain what had happened, brewery staff began draining the vat. It took time. These vessels were built to hold massive volumes, sealed at the top, and only accessible through metal ladders or hatches. As the golden fluid gurgled out and sank lower and lower, a dark shape began to appear at the bottom. It wasn't a tool, and it wasn't debris. It was Ronald Fishham's body, suspended in the remaining beer, limp and lifeless. The sheer size of the vat had made escape impossible once submerged. Fincham, for reasons still unknown, climbed inside, fully naked, and either slipped or intentionally submerged himself. At the time, there was no witnesses, no surveillance cameras. And obviously there was no surveillance cameras, and no immediate understanding of why he did it. What is known, however, is what happens when a human drowns, especially in a vat of alcohol. Once Fincham's head dipped beneath the surface and he couldn't reach the edge to hoist himself back up, his survival instincts would have kicked in. He likely thrashed and flailed, trying to push himself upward in the thick liquid. Beer is less buoyant than water due to its sugar and alcohol content, and it makes floating more difficult. There would have been no visibility, only darkness, bubbles, and the sloshing sound of his own movement echoing inside the still vat. As the oxygen in his lungs depleted, his throat and chest would have burned. He would have tried to hold his breath, fighting the urge to inhale, but eventually the body forces a desperate gasp in the liquid. The beer would have rushed into his mouth, throat, and lungs, filling them and cutting off oxygen at the cellular level. Coughing would have been impossible. The last moments would have included violent spasms, muscle cramps, and eventually the onset of hypoxia. As brain function faltered, awareness would have faded. Still, drowning usually takes about 2 to 3 minutes. If he remained conscious for even part of that time, the suffering would have been intense. When his body was recovered, his lungs were saturated, his airway blocked by foam and fluid. The pressure of being submerged in a sealed industrial vat surrounded by alcohol magnified the trauma. To be honest, it's kind of ironic. He drowned in the very product he had spent decades trying to help create. The coroner ultimately ruled the death as from natural causes, citing drowning, and noted that alcohol consumption might have impaired his judgment, but wasn't listed as a direct cause. To this day, it still remains unclear whether he had intended to die. No note was left, and he had no known mental health issues. Although some speculated that he was confused or mildly intoxicated and thought the beer might be soothing to wade in, his folded clothing, found neatly beside the vat, pointed toward an intentional entry. But the motive remained a mystery. This case would actually make headlines for its strange, almost surreal nature. Investigators determined that there had been no mechanical failure, the vats were structurally sound, and no one else was involved. It was simply one man left alone who entered a vat and never came out. And yes, the beer in the tank, over 35,000 pints, was discarded.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.